President Kennedy, who had come to office in 1960, was a keen advocate of using special forces to stamp out communist activity in third world countries. But Kennedy did not want American troops in Vietnam, although by 1963 he had authorized the presence of 16,000 military advisors in South Vietnam, and amongst them were the Green Berets. Kennedy was aware that he needed to send training teams to Laos to shore up the regime against the communists there. These were to be the first of the troops to see action in Vietnam. It did not take long until the Americans were caught up in the fighting themselves, and inevitably there followed the first American deaths. An agreement was reached with the communists in Laos, and the Ho Chi Minh Trail remained intact. The trail would be vital to help kill a generation of young Americans. In 1962, the Americans had helicopters in Vietnam, and early that year, these were sent on their first combat missions against the National Liberation Front, the NLF, the communists in the South. Operation Chopper was intended to ferry in South Vietnamese government troops to clear communist positions near Saigon. The war had taken a new course, and the NLF was taken by surprise. As a result, government forces chalked up a series of victories. This was the first of what came to be known as search and destroy missions. Intelligence would locate the enemy, call in ground and air support, which would encircle the communist forces, holding them down in one place. Paratroops would then drop into the battle zone and, with overwhelming firepower, eliminate them. That was the theory, which seemed to be working well at this early stage. The Americans dared to hope that government forces might even be victorious in the not-too-distant future. And Kennedy hoped to bring home the US mission before 1965 was over. The escalation in American involvement was of great concern to Ho Chi Minh, who feared the Americans might even be considering the use of their own ground forces to attack the north. Mao Zedong, the Chinese communist leader, was also concerned that the Americans should not gain a foothold in Vietnam, and promised military support to help Ho Chi Minh. 90,000 rifles were promised as immediate help. The Kennedy administration now evolved a tactic for the Green Berets in Vietnam that was used throughout the war. Using counterinsurgency tactics to go into the jungle villages, fight the guerrillas, and at the same time gain support for the government, train fighters, and improve the conditions of the inhabitants. Under attack from guerrilla fighters, the young Green Beret soldiers began to learn just what it was like to fight in the Vietnamese jungles. The NLF had changed their tactics since the first helicopter raids against them. Troop landing zones were covered with heavy machine guns, and units were practiced in dissipating quickly and vanishing into the jungle. Attacks were to last no more than 15 minutes, so government soldiers had no time to retaliate in force. These tactics blunted the effect of the American helicopters. When the NLF lost just 18 men at the Battle of Ap Bac on January 2, 1963, and 3 US advisors were killed, it was the first major Viet Cong victory and proved that they could match American firepower and even defeat it. Recruitment to the NLF increased, as did guerrilla attacks on arms dumps and strategic positions, and despite large-scale ground sweeps, the NLF fighters could not be captured in significant numbers. Diem's abysmal and corrupt regime that had violently put down protests by the majority Buddhist population, priests were arrested, temples raided and supporters shot in the streets, led the Americans to advise Vietnamese generals in 1963 that if a coup should take place, US aid would not be cut off. Chaos gripped the country. The generals, encouraged by the CIA, attacked the presidential palace. Kennedy was shocked when he heard that Diem had been executed, together with his brother Ngo Dinh Nhu, the man who had controlled the secret police. When John Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, took over at the White House. He had always been skeptical of involvement in Vietnam, and for him and his advisors, Vietnam seemed hardly worth discussing as a crisis zone. In the north of Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh and his advisors decided to intensify their efforts. The communists took advantage of political instability and increased their guerrilla warfare in the south, sensing the possibility of victory. The Chinese even considered sending troops to aid the Vietnamese should the Americans intervene. The NLF were now sending in men in larger groups of up to 1,000 to attack government forces. Another coup in the south demoralized the people even further. The crisis put pressure on President Johnson to act. Republicans urged a bombing campaign to be initiated, with the military chiefs of staff also advocating intervention. Johnson remained doubtful, but secret bombing against the north and along the borders to Laos was permitted. 1 year later, the situation was changing quickly. On August 2nd, 1964, the USS Maddox was in the Bay of Tonkin off the North Vietnamese coast on an intelligence-gathering mission when it opened fire on North Vietnamese torpedo boats that had mistaken the ship for a South Vietnamese vessel. 2 days later, the captain of the Maddox reported that he thought a second attack was underway. The White House ordered retaliatory action. The North was bombed, and 2 US planes were brought down on the mission. The Chinese Prime Minister, Chu Enlai, reinforced his air units along the borders, and the North Vietnamese Air Force prepared for action. The result of this engagement was the American Tonkin Gulf Resolution, passed on August 7, 1964. It gave Johnson the power to use whatever force he felt necessary in the defense of Southeast Asia. Vietnam was about to discover exactly what that meant. Fearing bombing raids on their own territory, the North Vietnamese could only trust that American fear of China would prevent any such action. They decided on sending the North Vietnamese army to the south before the Americans had a chance to attack. A 6-week trek along the Ho Chi Minh Trail would see them in Vietnam in early 1965, where they would attempt to cut South Vietnam in two. In November, Bien Hoa Air Base near Saigon came under fire, and B-57 bombers were destroyed and damaged. 4 Americans were killed. A timely reminder to the Americans as an election drew close that involvement at ground level would cost lives. Johnson held back from retaliatory action and won the election. Vietnam seemed to be about to disintegrate. The Viet Cong were now on the offensive, striking just 40 miles from the capital and causing enormous casualties amongst South Vietnamese soldiers. If nothing were done, the South would be lost to communism. Johnson allowed his military to plan a campaign of action. Airstrikes were to be used if the Viet Cong attacks continued. There was not long to wait for those attacks. On February the 7th, 1965, The US helicopter base at Pleiku in the Central Highlands was attacked by commandos of the NLF who killed 9 Americans. Johnson gave the order for retaliation. The Americans would attack the North Vietnamese directly, and the most terrifying conflict since World War II was about to engulf the US armies. US fighter planes were sent to targets just inside the North Vietnamese border. Undeterred, a fresh Viet Cong attack took place only 3 days later. 23 Americans were killed in a hotel bombing. Permission was given for a more concerted effort to end hostilities. Operation Rolling Thunder was born, with limited objectives but of long-term duration. Yet another military coup took place in the south. It was obvious that more US soldiers would be needed to hold back the Viet Cong. The final figure was settled at 200,000. By the beginning of 1966, another 184,000 troops had arrived, and their numbers would swell to over 430,000. In December, President Johnson offered to temporarily cease bombing and open talks. The bombers were halted for 37 days. The bad weather that followed the ending of the pause meant that the North Vietnamese had even longer to reinforce and regroup. Pilots trained in Russia and China were now back in the country, and new planes were being delivered. There were some 5,000 anti-aircraft weapons sighted at the most vital points, with radar-guided guns of 85 and 100 mm caliber that could take down a plane at almost 20,000 feet. The result was that over the north, US Air Force losses amounted to nearly 20 planes a month. This was 1 in 40 of the planes available. With pilots flying on missions every 2 days or even more frequently, morale began to fall. In an attempt to reduce the strain on pilots, more carrier planes were brought in and search and rescue ships placed off the North Vietnamese coast. Planes were allocated fixed areas of attack that enabled pilots to get to know their areas better and thus be more effective. The losses continued, however. Technology aided the pilots in the form of the A-6 intruder attack aircraft that boasted the most advanced targeting and navigation systems and was able to fly in any weather 24 hours a day. And there were early warning radar planes to warn of MiG activity or SAM missiles, which were also targeted by Wild Weasel aircraft and their Shrike radar-seeking missiles. Other planes helped jam the radar systems of anti-aircraft guns. The heavy raids in the north produced an unwelcome effect in American eyes. The war had unified the Vietnamese people behind the leadership of Ho Chi Minh. With military equipment being sent by the Russians and the Chinese, the new all-weather MiG fighters carrying infrared homing missiles were particularly effective. Ho Chi Minh and his political companions were growing more confident. The longer the fighting continued and the Americans found themselves unable to finish the war, the greater the chances of communist success. Meanwhile, US bombing campaigns in the south were considered more important than strikes against the north, and the transport planes, fighters and bombers could be called in by any field unit to support ground operations, often saving the lives of the hard-pressed ground forces. Except that the bombs, rockets and napalm killed many civilians, further alienating the population. The American bombing could not prevent the flow of supplies of weapons and men to the south from increasing. Pontoon bridges enabled bombed bridges to be bypassed, and Viet Cong troop movement would take place during the hours of darkness. Fighter bombers were accurate in the open, but next to useless in the jungle where the Viet Cong hid. Carpet bombing with the B-52 The bomber that could carry 51, 750 and 500-pound bombs was the option chosen to overcome the problem. Together with a modified bomber that could carry 108 bombs, the tonnage was formidable. By day or night, with the help of radar, these payloads were soon falling on the Ho Chi Minh Trail and other Viet Cong supply lines. They flew in from Guam in the Pacific Ocean, and every plane needed its own tanker to refuel in flight. The South Vietnamese capital, Saigon, with its 2 million inhabitants, where the headquarters of the American and South Vietnamese military were sited, was the town that the Americans most needed to protect. This town symbolized the freedom of the South, and was thus the jewel that the North most coveted. There were tens of thousands of Viet Cong in the jungles around the capital. The combat units were well supplied and presented a constant threat to its security. On the 8th of January 1966, in an attempt to find and eliminate the Viet Cong headquarters for the Saigon region, 8,000 American troops set out on their most far-reaching sweep of the area surrounding Saigon since the war began. Believed to be less than 20 miles distant from the capital, the headquarters included a vast set of underground tunnels. It was in these that hospitals, the Saigon military headquarters and the political office were to be found. Unfortunately, word had already reached the Viet Cong of an impending attack, and thousands of troops had been moved from the area, leaving just 1,000 men. Nonetheless, the NLF felt they could hold out fighting in the tunnels. The US campaign got underway with an artillery bombardment, and as the infantry moved in, they were subjected to small arms fire and booby traps from Viet Cong that they could not see and who disappeared in and out of the tunnels. It was soon clear that the operation was not going well. Men were dying, and only gradually did the Americans discover the entrances to the tunnels. But they had no idea of the extent of the underground network, and once the operation ended, the Viet Cong had been able to keep their entire infrastructure intact. The attempt to clear the area for an American base proved difficult, as the guerrillas kept up a barrage of fire and attacks that the Americans could only repulse using all the weaponry at their disposal. Only after months of being subjected to attacks inside the base did the Americans find that they were sitting on top of tunnels. The entrances were sealed up, but soldiers remained in ignorance of the main complex close by and did not know of its existence until years later. The American commanders were anxious to face the highly mobile 9th Viet Cong Division that was ready to begin a spring offensive in a full-scale fight. March the 5th, 1966. The first clash of American and Viet Cong troops during this phase came at Lo Cay, north of Saigon, where US planes repulsed the attackers. Then the Americans advanced 2 days later, using artillery to beat off the enemy assaults. The firepower was devastating and cost the Viet Cong hundreds of deaths. But there was no sense of victory amongst the Americans. The Viet Cong vanished into the jungle depths to regroup and fight again. So the search and destroy missions continued. Late April brought another offensive, with 5,000 American infantry troops, large numbers of helicopters and armored vehicles taking part. It was to last for 3 weeks, and found the Americans involved in hundreds of contacts with the enemy, but resulted in just 100 Viet Cong dead. General Westmoreland's strategy of hitting the Viet Cong hard so that their losses would eventually outweigh their ability to replenish men and supplies was clearly not working. He ordered his commanders to take the war to the enemy. In June, with the new orders effective, the situation did not improve, and one attack by the Viet Cong almost ended in disaster for the US forces. As usual, the enemy troops vanished into the dense jungle or even crossed into Cambodia, where General Tan was marshalling his troops for a campaign in the dry season in November. The North Vietnamese army now had more than 60,000 fighters in the south, with 10,000 based in the Central Highlands. These NVA fighters would often mount attacks with 2,000 men. They were hardened, well-trained, disciplined and experienced fighters, who had for the most part been engaging the South Vietnamese forces, although American bases had also come under attack. General Giap believed that these mountainous central areas were ideal for large-scale military offensives, as the weather would hamper American airstrikes, and his men were not far from supplies in Cambodia. He therefore wanted to turn this area into a killing zone, to inflict the greatest number of casualties on the American forces possible. To limit the number of US troops available to confront the Vietnamese in battle, the NLA and NVA made the roads linking US bases unsafe and pinned down as many troops as possible in the defense of bases and lines of communication. By late in the year 1966, the NLF 9th Division was almost back at full strength following the battles during the summer. The Ho Chi Minh Trail had proved its worth yet again, as supplies flowed down to the fighters. Robert McNamara, the US Defense Secretary, went to Vietnam to visit the aircraft carriers in October 1966, with Chairman of the Chief of Staff, General Wheeler, and Pacific Fleet Commander, Admiral Sharp. With the North Vietnamese unwavering in their support for the war, McNamara was increasingly questioning the reasons for the American bombing, and even US participation in Vietnam. Pilots were being lost every month. Costs for the air campaign Rolling Thunder had spiraled to over $1.2 billion. The military leadership was not happy when McNamara said that the planes should be redeployed to attack the communist supply routes, a less risky and expensive undertaking for US pilots. The military argued that it was the restrictions imposed on bombing targets that were causing the problems. By October, the Vietnamese division based in what was known as War Zone C in the west of the country was busy planning for the offensives to be carried out once the November dry season arrived. The Americans were aware of the preparations, and intelligence missions tried to second-guess the targets chosen by the NLA. Before missions with the Black Hawk helicopters, intelligence had been gathered, firstly from Kit Carsons, who were Viet Cong who were tired of life in the jungle and had defected to the Americans, and secondly from stay-behind teams, who covered a specific area for enemy movements and would then order in air power to unleash lethal fire on enemy positions. It was thought that special forces bases were a likely battleground, and intense sweeps were launched under the code name Operation Attleboro on September the 14th, 1966. The Americans soon found an arms depot, and as they advanced into the jungle, the full-scale confrontation the commanders had always wanted finally took place. Thousands of troops poured in on both sides, with American reinforcements under almost constant ambush. Using their tunnels and trenches for protection, attacks with thousands of Viet Cong were launched on the American camps. Whereas the Viet Cong could withstand the ferocious air assaults, American troops were being decimated, and many units came close to being wiped out. Inadequate tactical coordination between units and the inexperience of the American 196th Light Infantry played their part, and had it not been for close air support, this campaign could have ended in a catastrophe for the US forces. More infantry and armoured units were rushed to the area, with 22,000 troops arriving within days of the start of the battle, as the commanders sensed that this was the confrontation they had been seeking. Had they understood the tactics of the Viet Cong, they would have realized what would happen next. The 9th Division was ordered to retreat. The division split into smaller units and vanished into the jungle and Cambodia. The Americans lost 155 soldiers in the operation, which continued until November the 24th, by which time some 1,000 NLF fighters had been killed. Once again, though, the commanders had been deprived of their all-out confrontation. They could console themselves with the fact that, with the capture of plans, documents and stores, Viet Cong plans had been thrown into disarray. American commanders drew the conclusion from the operation that the Viet Cong would stand and fight if their bases came under attack. In an attempt to cripple the North Vietnamese war effort, the 13 major fuel storage tanks in the north were now to be targeted by bombers. There were many sites in and around Hanoi, and the first raids were planned for June the 29th, 1966. The Air Force and Navy were employed. The strikes, which took place over many weeks, were devastating. They took out 76% of North Vietnam's oil storage capacity. But not being able to hit MiG airfields meant that the MiGs were in the sky and could use their lethal weapons. SAM missiles were used in increasing numbers as defences were reinforced and many US pilots lost their lives. Unfortunately, the bombing campaign was not able to stop supplies reaching the south on the jungle trails. In fact, more supplies than ever were finding the way into the hands of the NLA and NVA forces. The American bombing of their country even brought the North Vietnamese closer together in their determination to withstand the onslaught. Now, as the year drew to a close, 6,000 Americans had lost their lives and 30,000 had been injured. The average age of an American soldier was just over 22 years old. 385,000 troops were stationed in Vietnam, and 60,000 sailors crewed the warships. Despite losing 60,000 fighters, the Viet Cong had increased their troop numbers to over 280,000, and General Westmoreland was forced to admit that he had failed to achieve his aim of reducing the ability of the Viet Cong to wage war. One area west of Saigon stretched over 60 square miles and was known as the Iron Triangle. It lay alongside the Saigon River and was a web of underground tunnels. Not far from there lay Cu Chi, another strongly fortified Viet Cong base. General Westmoreland decided to send troops in to annihilate the enemy in the Iron Triangle. 2 divisions were to be used to trap the Viet Cong in Operation Cedar Falls. A second attempt was also going to be made to eradicate the Viet Cong Saigon headquarters around Cu Chi. This would help clear the entire area of guerrilla fighters. 20,000 leaflets were dropped, warning the civilians to evacuate the area immediately. Days of bombing raids by the B-52s followed. Airstrikes and artillery bombardments took place, and firewalls were put down to prevent a Viet Cong retreat. On January the 8th, 1967, 16,000 US troops and 14,000 South Vietnamese troops began the advance. In one village, 100 NLF fighters barely fired a shot before they were captured, so great was the surprise. The inhabitants were rounded up and interrogated as their houses were razed to the ground. Pressing forward, the Americans began to uncover the entrances to the myriad tunnels. They now knew what to expect, and specialists had been trained to go down and investigate. This unenviable task was in the hands of men known as tunnel rats. Mines, gunfire and traps awaited them in the narrow passageways. Success was limited. Nothing the Americans tried, from gas to flooding to explosive detonation, could flush out the Viet Cong further along the tunnels in any numbers. The tunnels they found were just a tiny proportion of the whole system. What they discovered inside was astonishing. Huge quantities of military supplies, sufficient rice for 13,000 Viet Cong for a year, a large hospital with over a ton of medical supplies, documents that revealed the location of American bases and the private addresses of Americans in Saigon. For the 19 days of the operation, the fighting had been mostly localized, and the 72 American deaths caused mainly through sniping and booby traps. 720 Viet Cong had died. General Westmoreland did not fall in with the view that Operation Cedar had been a total success. No major battles had taken place, and the NLF headquarters was still undetected. The Iron Triangle was destroyed. 20-foot wide paths were driven through the jungle so that movement could be detected from the air. 60 square miles were made uninhabitable. The civilians transferred to refugee camps. Aircraft sprayed defoliants, destroying the vegetation and making agriculture impossible. It became what was designated a US free fire zone, where anything could be fired upon at any time. Within weeks, the Viet Cong were back. At the beginning of February 1967, President Johnson ordered a stop to the Rolling Thunder bombing runs over the north as a prelude to opening negotiations. Ho Chi Minh demanded a complete cessation of bombing without offering even talks in return. As might be expected, the North immediately began to send increased quantities of equipment southwards once the bombing ceased. Frustrated, Johnson agreed to new bombing targets in the north to include airfields, industry and power plants. The military were to have their way, and the thrust of the campaign would be strengthened. The revitalized strategy was put into effect in April. Targets closer to Hanoi and Haiphong were also now considered legitimate, which brought US pilots into furious air combat with MiG fighters. 26 fighters from the north were shot down in May alone. This was a serious blow, as it meant that North Vietnamese pilot numbers had been reduced by 50%. The effect of the bombing was that the North lost 32% of its power-generating ability in the air raids, far too little to seriously disrupt the North's manufacturing capability. In Washington, the wrangling between politicians and military continued. Whereas the politicians such as McNamara wanted to see no escalation, the military was pushing for even greater intervention. General Westmoreland was also impatient for more progress. Commanders were urged to plan a massive campaign that would give the Americans the initiative. Operation Junction City was launched, the biggest search and destroy operation so far, in which 35,000 American and South Vietnamese troops were involved. The aim was to destroy the Viet Cong Military Central Office for South Vietnam, together with the main bases in War Zone C, along the border to Cambodia west of Saigon. To the extent that the Viet Cong leadership was highly mobile and not tied to one location, this operation was not going to change the situation. The battle plan envisaged surrounding the Viet Cong in a horseshoe formation and sending armoured troops and infantry in through the gap. Camps would then be set up, the Saigon River bridged, and this area become the focus of American operations. Operation Junction City was launched on the 22nd of February 1967, with 240 helicopters filling the sky. Fighter bombers and helicopter gunships smashed the landing zones in the biggest air operation of the war. Almost 800 paratroops sealed off the top of the horseshoe, and 2,000 troops were swiftly advancing into the jungle from the open end, together with armoured units. In the dense jungle, the Americans found the ground was filled with tunnels and bunkers. Yet again, the Viet Cong evaded the American trap, abandoning their positions, and US soldiers fell to snipers' bullets rather than in battle. When fighting did take place, it was at the instigation of the Viet Cong, who could only be forced to retire once planes and artillery had opened fire on them. When they decided to stop, they vanished into the jungle in small groups of platoon size, from 16 to 40 men, and slipped through the undergrowth between the American lines. As the Americans began to set up their bases and lorries began to ferry building materials along Route 13 to build the bridge over the Saigon River, the Viet Cong returned. US bases reported assaults by groups of 1,000 Viet Cong on their positions. Again, it was only American artillery and air power that rescued the men on the ground. After 82 days, Operation Junction City was finished on May 14, 1967. During the operation, huge quantities of stores, weapons and equipment had fallen into American hands, bases and other installations razed to the ground. 282 Americans had fallen to Viet Cong attacks since the Cedar Falls advance. 1,728 Viet Cong had lost their lives. The operation was considered to be a success by US commanders, although there had been no major battles and the Viet Cong leadership had disappeared over the border into Cambodia. Neither were there sufficient forces to ensure a permanent occupation of the area. Scarcely had the American troops moved on when the Viet Cong returned, rebuilt the bases and took control of War Zone C once more. In a sign of the frustration that progress was not being made in diminishing the Viet Cong forces, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara flew over to Vietnam in July for talks with commanders. How many troops were needed to get a grip on the situation? McNamara had considered 500,000, but even that number now seemed too little for the task ahead. He told President Johnson that the war was not going to end soon, and that other measures to stabilize the country had to be taken with more emphasis on civilian aid. Pressure on President Johnson to agree to the military view and escalate the war intensified in August 1967. He bowed to the pressure, giving his consent to expanding the Rolling Thunder bombing in order to avert a worse political dilemma. He knew that a Senate subcommittee was going to agree that North Vietnam should be subjected to heavier bombing raids, McNamara decided that his position was untenable and announced that he would resign from office. On the streets of America, displeasure with the growing number of American deaths and the whole Vietnam War was making itself felt. The Viet Cong were about to make the situation even worse for the Americans. They intended to forsake their policy of attack and withdraw and face the Americans in an all-out battle that would win them the war. Their attacks began in January 1968 at the time of the Vietnamese New Year. It was called Tet. For the Viet Cong, the offensive that began with such high hopes would turn into a disaster.